last time we were able to discuss this issue, we were dealing with the controversy surrounding the overturning of Roe versus Wade. It was a decision made in the Supreme Court in the United States many years ago that essentially conflated the right to privacy in one of our amendments with the right to an abortion, and that, of course, being in federal law. Both people across party lines acknowledged that this was a very poorly formed law, and even Democrats like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the hopefully overwhelming majority of Republicans would, of course, oppose this law. But mass media and propaganda being what they are, don't let the facts get in the way of your feelings. The response was outright violent. Now, of course, every single display of violence in the physical was also reflected in the vocal, and the Twitter sphere gave us no shortage of rehashings of old arguments in favor of abortion, even from a biblical perspective, apparently. So what we wanted to do is to take some time, again, to clarify and double down on this issue, to make sure that those of you listening, as well as maybe those of you asking these very questions for yourselves, are familiar with the arguments and also that there are responses or even clarifications to it. Now, obviously, any one of us who have interacted with another human being with a brain than our own are going to hear things we hadn't thought of before, so we want to be prepared. But of course, also knowing not just what to think about an issue, but how to think about an issue. That would be our goal. I can think of, maybe right off the bat, 3 quote-unquote biblically based, and of course extra-biblically based mostly, arguments that are presented in favor of abortion. But noting as well that this was your idea, why don't you start us off? We'll go back and forth in addressing some of these.
Yeah, no, sounds good. So the beauty of Roe versus Wade being overturned is, in the way that the United States democracy works, is that the original intent is that you would have to convince your neighbor of the truth so that they would vote for it in the ballot. When the Supreme Court made this order, basically it took away the need for debate, because it doesn't matter how many people I convince that Roe versus Wade is unlawful or that abortion is bad. The Supreme Court then held the power, and the Supreme Court is unelected. So it really wouldn't matter how many people you convinced in your local politic that this is the correct way to doing things. It wouldn't make any difference in federal law. So what Roe versus Wade has done, the overturning of Roe versus Wade has done, is it's returned the issue to the states, and now you must convince your neighbor of the truth that you see in order for them to vote on that and to allow that to become the law within your personal state. That's how things were supposed to be, and now that's how things are once again. So
we're the United States, not the kingship of Washington, D.C.
That's right. And so, as some pro-lifers have said, and I'm actually going to hang out with my buddy who works at Hands of Hope next week, which I'm really excited about to see how they're dealing with it. Hands of Hope is a local Tucson ministry that is a pregnancy center for women who are basically in a crisis pregnancy. They're in an unwanted pregnancy. They don't know what to do. This place offers them resources and helps them to make a decision to keep the child, as well as directing them to particular resources that will help them to keep the child.
And by the way, that's not a shameless plug. The relevance of those facts will be the answer to one of our issues.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, whatever city or state that you're living in, this is not, the overturning of the Roe versus Wade did not finish the issue. It just started it. So as Christians...
It made it an issue we can actually fight.
Absolutely. So as Christians, now more than ever, you should know exactly why you are pro-life. And if you're not sure whether or not you're pro-life, hopefully me and Sean will do some work here to convince you. Please ask questions. If you are pro-choice or you're on the fence, please ask questions. We will try to answer them in as loving and sincere way as we can. But yeah, this is the time to know where you stand on this issue and to be ready to give a defense for why you believe these things biblically as well as reasonably. So absolutely, this is the time where the fight begins. If you have local organizations like Hands of Hope, start giving to them, start asking them what they need, because they're probably figuring this out on the fly, right? In the state of Arizona, last I checked, we're going to revert back to our 1912 law, which is complete absence from abortion. So we'll see if that actually goes through. We'll see. Our colorful mayor, Regina Romero, is saying that she is instructing police officers to not enforce that law, which I don't know how that's going to work. But, you know, there's a lot of things in the air right now. We'll see how these things pan out. But as Christians, as believers, we need to be more ready than ever to, as I said, reason out these particular dialogues and determine where we stand. So one of the interesting arguments, and some of these arguments are really, just so you know, they're very, very bad. So I'm going to be doing my best to give the best version of them.
You're not going to make fun of them and belittle the argument. You're going to do what's called an Iron Man. You're going to try to solidify this argument in order to properly address what little merit in it can be.
Absolutely. So the argument that I saw, it was on Facebook. Someone said something to the effect of, God is certainly pro-choice because he sent the flood. And the flood, after all, wiped out women and children as well as unborn babies. So the way I could kind of, because that's a ridiculous argument, let me kind of Iron Man this a little bit. Perhaps what they're saying is, if we as Christians are supposed to be pro-life, how come God does allow for people to be killed in the Old Testament, as well as, you know, there's certain people, even in the New Testament Christianity, who would say that there are reasons to say go to war or to exhibit capital punishment towards offenders of certain crimes, right? So as Christians, when we say we are pro-life, does that mean that we have to be anti-death no matter what, right? We cannot allow for anyone to die. So let me give my answer to this particular question, then I'll pass it over to you. So the way I would answer it is I would say, okay, so as a Christian, when we say we're pro-life, we don't mean that all life should be protected no matter what. What we mean is that life is inherently valuable. And in fact, life is so inherently valuable that sometimes certain people need to be deprived of their life in order to protect the lives of others. So for instance, if you're dealing with someone who is a mass murderer, a killer, if I were to end their life, I would be actually protecting the lives of all those that they would eventually kill. Or in the instance of war, if we invade Germany during World War II and end up killing many German soldiers, the death of those soldiers will actually preserve the life of many millions of Jews. So, and many other people, and many other people that the Germans were killing. They weren't they weren't very discriminate in their ways of killing. So that deprivation of certain life protects the greater quantity of life. Now, we're not, as some philosophers call it, utilitarians. Utilitarianism basically just states everything you do has to be the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's not what we're talking about. So in other words, a utilitarian would say, well, if that's the case, then maybe I should preemptively murder people who might end up becoming murderers. So, for instance,
we'll deal with another potential issue in a moment.
Exactly. So if I feel as though someone is sending up warning signs of being a potential murderer, maybe I should just kill them now, and therefore it would prevent them from ever killing anyone ever. We're not pure utilitarians, but we do believe that certain activities, certain actions are worthy of retribution. They're worthy of some amount of justice. Now, when it comes to the flood of Noah, it wasn't purely preventative, meaning God wasn't sending a flood because he's like, well, a lot of these people are going to grow up to be evil, so let me kill them now. It was punitive. It was retributionary. In other words, the behavior of the peoples of the day were worthy of death. They were worthy of being killed. And we could probably, we got a question about some of the pre-flood sexual behaviors. And so we could talk about that. And social behaviors. So it wasn't just preventative. There was a consequentialist aspect to it, meaning that God was trying to prevent these cultures from being able to propagate and cause more damage to his world. But there was also a retributionary aspect to it as well. It wasn't purely preventative. It was also retributionary. So as Christians, we're not purely consequentialist. I have heard some Christians try to say, well, if the majority of abortions are happening, and this is, by the way, if you dissect this argument for more than 10 seconds, you realize how monstrous and horrible it is. But some people say, well, a lot of the abortions done are done in low-income areas. A lot of low-income areas spawn a lot of criminals and murderers. So if we allow abortion to be illegal, then a lot more of these people will be born, and therefore there will be a lot more crime and a lot more murder. This is a terrible argument. First of all, it's highly racist. It does definitely speak to the philosophy of the people who founded Planned Parenthood, like Margaret Sanger, who actually believed this way and actually believed that quote-unquote undesirables, which would be minorities, should be sterilized so they couldn't propagate their genes and ruin the country. So we're not going to go down that road. Yet. But But as a Christian, like I said, we're not saying that we're purely utilitarian. We're also not saying that all life is inherently worthy. I mean, all life should be protected at all costs. There are certain things that you can do that can forfeit your right to life, just as there are certain things that you can do that can forfeit your right to liberty. That's why we agree in putting people in prison.
And that's what you meant by punitive.
That's
there
right.
are actions that warrant consequences.
Exactly. When it comes to the unborn, they haven't done anything yet, good or bad. So that means that whatever you're doing to them in the womb can't possibly be punitive because they haven't done anything that warrants any type of consequence other than being conceived, which is a sin of the parents, not a sin of the child. So therefore, because of that, they should be, their right to life, their right to liberty, their right to pursued happiness should be preserved because we're not doing anything punitive to them. That's what we mean.
And also the reason why you're bringing up this argument isn't to divert from the flood, it's to show the flood was an entirely different scenario. We're not equating God taking the lives of the world at this point because they had all done something bad any more than this argument portrays the flood of Noah to be an entirely utilitarian or punitive action. God would be the only party who would know the future of these individuals, and this is where the utilitarian argument comes in, to know whether they would become more wicked than their ancestors or not. We see this being mentioned during the judgment of Israel.
Right.
But if, on the other hand, we're to note it wasn't an entirely lost cause, otherwise God could just Thanos snap the planet and start over, he spared Noah and his family and used Noah and his family for 120 years to explain to people exactly what the ark was for as they were building it. But the point being made is this: he's showing you in this argument that these are two entirely different scenarios, and to then narrow it down to, not to straw man, but to get to the core of the issue, God takes life, therefore why can't I? The answer is you're not God.
Right.
Which is then what brings us to another objection. When I take it on myself to know the end from the beginning, I claim to have this omniscience, this clairvoyance, to be able to see into the future and say that this child's life could potentially result in them sinning, not receiving Jesus and going to hell. But if the child is preemptively sent to heaven, wouldn't that be a long-term benefit to them, rather than just allowing them to live life, act out their sinful nature, and maybe end up separated from God forever? There's two ways I could deal with this, and both of which are equally, again, horrifying when you understand the implications. The first mistake in this line of thinking is, again, going to the book of 2 Samuel, where David has his child taken from him as a result of the sin in which he was conceived, that this was a sin against David. But David knows, and it says this in the chapter, I will go to him, but he shall not return to me. At the moment that the child died, he knew God's decision was final. This child has physically died. I'm going to go to him. So David had a working knowledge that this child, this unborn child, was not killed and then sent to hell, or separated from God, literally, as a result of his actions. The only one who was being ultimately punished in a material sense was him as a result of his sin. The child received eternal life according to his perspective, and that's affirmed later on in Scripture. Now, the assumption then is to say, once again, like the utilitarian argument, so the efficiency of life should work in getting the most people to heaven as possible. And if I could rig the system so that no one has the chance to live life, therefore that's a better life. So 0 is better than -1. If I'm willing to commit murder, hopefully we already see the problem, then I'm capable of making this decision for them rather than this decision being made by the individual itself. And that's the biggest mistake. Are you God? Are you taking that right on yourself to not only know that person's future, which you don't, and at the same time be able to argue from an assumption made in Scripture, one that we don't argue definitively, that we leave in the hands of a God, not you God, a God who does all things well. And note, he is the one who will judge this individual, not I will decide his eternal destiny for him by rigging the system through a horrific act. When we understand the value of life and its worthwhileness to be sought out to its logical end, the goal isn't to ultimately get someone in a environment where they accept the gospel. There are people who are born into perfectly legitimate Christian homes and reject the gospel. There are people born into vehemently anti-Christian homes and receive a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's not for you to decide. That's between them and the Lord. And if I'm going to pretend to be the Lord, that's like 4 sins at the same time. Not only in taking that right on myself, I'm shedding man's blood, and that is a punitive act.
Right.
I'm also claiming, I'm making an idol out of myself, a right that belongs to God alone. And this is, again, don't just take our word for it. In Deuteronomy 32 and verse 39, note this exclusive trait that God describes for himself. He says, "See now that I, even I, am, and there is no God besides me." Write that down, because he then goes on to say, what kind of things does this God, the God that he alone is, do? I kill and I make alive. I wound and heal, nor is there any that can deliver from my hand. The only one with the right to exercise power over life and death, which abortion is taking on ourselves to do, that's why it's sinful. I don't have the ability to see this person's future. I don't have the right to take this person's eternal destiny into my manipulative little hands, and I also don't do myself any favors before God by taking those rights on myself and committing murder, which is why the first capital punishment in Genesis chapter 9 was laid down in law. If man sheds man's blood, then by man his blood shall be shed. For what? He was made in the image of God. That is, as you stated, the intrinsic value of all human life, something worth preserving, and even, catch this, the opportunity and literal chance, life itself, for them to say no. And that needs to be preserved. If we take it on ourselves to pretend we're God, that is evil. That is idolatrous. That is murder. And that's why the foundation of the pro-life versus pro-abortion argument is centered exactly on that. Is that child a life? Now, this is where the debate then goes on, and I'm kind of, giving you a layup here, but the argument's often then made, well, according to the Bible, life begins at first breath. If you go to the book of Genesis, because you read Genesis chapter 9, I assume you believe Genesis chapter 2, where it says that when God breathed into man's nostrils, then he became a living being. This is Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7. So in the case of Adam, the first time life is ever conceived, this is done through breath, that God's breath classified him as a living being. So why don't you believe the Bible?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and the only way you could read Genesis 2 and come away from that passage with that type of theology or understanding of reality is if you already believe that. Yeah. There's no way you'd be able to read into it, which is why we don't really have any massive rabbinic upholding of that interpretation. We don't have any Christian upholding of that interpretation for thousands of years, is because no one saw that until this happened. What we're talking about breath, is we're talking about God's animating principle within the life of someone. So we're talking about the special creation of Adam, in which when God forms Adam, Adam is perfectly formed by God out of the dust of the earth, and he's not alive yet. So he's a corpse at that point. He's a cadaver, right? So when you have a body, you don't have life. And by the way, I'm not for the preservation of rights of just simple human resembling bodies. So if somebody drops dead, I'm not saying, well, that person is totally worthy of having all the same liberty and rights as everyone else, so let's prop them up. How dare us put them in a confining box and bury them in the ground? That's so inhumane. That's so barbaric. No, we preserve life, not just the body. At that point, all Adam was a body. And God needed to animate Adam through the breathing in of life. Now that the creation is going, the animation of the flesh happens before we inhale, before we're able to inhale. So some Christians, by the way, they thought of this as the quickening. This is what Thomas Aquinas believed, and it's because he was ignorant. He didn't know when human babies were able to be functional, when they were able to have life. So he assumed that, well, when a mom feels the baby kicking, right, that's the quickening, then the baby has life, and then we should preserve the life of the child. That happens around 16 to 18 weeks, by the way, those of you guys who didn't know. That is also inaccurate because we know when the child has life. So when the child has life, that is when any type of organic life, we know that it is living when it has organic growth. So if I were to look at this table, for instance, I can make it grow, quote unquote, by adding more boards to it. Now, even though I'm making it grow, you would still say, well, the wood is still dead. The reason why is because there's no organic growth. When there's organic growth, then we say that something that is biologically alive is actually containing life. So the second a human being has biological life, it's alive, right? That's when the animating principle is at work. And again, we see the more technology we get, we see how active babies are. Even when you can't see them with the naked eye, by the way, they are very active, right? They're moving around. They have working hearts at around 5 weeks. They have the ability to even do directed motion. They have some amount of consciousness very, very young. Before most women even know they're pregnant with a baby, the babies have life. They have being. So Adam was a completely different scenario. Before God breathed into him, Adam was not alive. That's what we believe. He was formed as just a body, and God animated that body with the breath of life. After the creation of Adam, that's how things go. So it's one of those interpretations where, like I said, nobody would come away from that passage just reading it, believing that. I've read that passage a bunch of times, and when I first heard the argument, by the way, this was with last year, that some people were talking about it online, I was like, I have never heard of that. Where did they even get that from? And when they pointed back to Genesis 2, I was like, I have read that passage at least 100 times. I have never, even looking at it critically, right? Yeah. Even looking at it critically, I never even saw that someone could interpret it that way. I've read commentary on it. I've read, like I said, rabbinic commentary. I've read Christian commentary. Never have I heard anyone, even on the fringes, take that passage that way, except until this huge pro-choice movement has been going on. So last couple years, that's when people are starting to interpret it that way.
It's called eisegesis.
That's
reading
right.
Into, not out of the text, and that is not how you handle writing.
That's right. So I hope you guys got some out of it. Maybe in the future we'll come up with more common objections to the pro-life movement. If you guys hear any, please ask them on the show. This is a very good time to start dialoguing with your neighbors, start dialoguing with your friends. What do you think about the pro-choice versus pro-life argument? Where are you? The vast majority of people, by the way, are somewhere in the middle, right? They don't want to perfectly preserve life all the way from the moment of conception, but they also aren't on the side of, well, let's allow for abortion even to the 40th week. Most people are, for some restrictions, just not a lot. Talk to them through it. Why do you think that way? Why is a baby at 15 weeks more worthy of life than a baby at 20 weeks or a baby at 25 weeks? What is the difference? How do you define it? What is your argumentation? Great time to ask questions, great time to get people's perspectives, and to try your best to convince.
And also note as well that not all can be. If you run into the kind of person who says, I believe that you should have that right up until 5 years of age. I've had that conversation this week. It wasn't productive, let me tell you that much. They are in a place where the Holy Spirit needs to do some softening before you can do any prodding. If that is the kind of person you're dealing with, or if you can, and this is very much a recommended resource, don't necessarily find mutilated pictures of abortions, post the traumatizing children and so forth. It's not as effective. Maybe wait till junior high for that. But if on the other hand you are talking to someone who's just not convinced it's the stage of life, find a fetal development chart. Get it printed out and show it to someone and just say, point, where do you think life begins? And that is a phenomenal, to quote our good friend Dan Swanson, phenomenal metric in order to find out whether someone is going to be objective or not. And if they are just, looking at this and going, well, I don't know, or just refusing to give an answer, then give them space. That's the only thing that's going to be productive. If, on the other hand, they would point to a stage, then know enough about the chart and the issues to show, okay, why is that more life than those before it? And if you can get the conversation in better directions, note, as again, quoting, I guess, pastors and apologists that we know and love and hold dear, Greg Koukl made his observation in the book Tactics. We're not always meant to bring people to the altar in regards to evangelism and salvation. Sometimes we can just do a little bit of gardening, prepare for future works of God in their heart and in their minds. This can also be true in any form of conversation. So make sure that you don't, A, put it on yourself the burden of convincing them that this life is a life, even if you're talking to someone who calls himself a Christian. And also don't bring with it the expectation that every person is going to be rational, because this is an entirely driven emotional issue. If it was factual, then you wouldn't see pregnancy centers being burned down. You wouldn't see people being attacked and literally growled at in the streets. I'm not kidding, by the way, saying I love to kill babies.
Right.
This is an emotional issue, and that needs to be sorted out and left to run its course before intellectualism can be. And the way that we prevent ourselves, this is again speaking from my experience, from disappointment, from frustration, and even playing on their terms, getting angry when it's not warranted, is bringing with yourself a burden that's not appropriate. Just have a goal in the conversation to say words, and if they're good ones, even better, but don't bring that expectation and say, I have to convince this person to be pro-life or I've failed. That's not the case. It's the Holy Spirit's job to change hearts and minds.
Yeah, and you could also flip that, which is really cool as well. There are a lot of people in the pro-life movement who aren't Christians. So it is an exciting time to be able to join hands with somebody, you know, whether they are Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, actually a lot of Muslims are pro-life as well, and even, yes, atheists, agnostics are pro-life. It is a good time to start communicating even with fellow pro-lifers about, hey, that's great, you believe you're pro-life. Why are you pro-life? What do you think about that? And allow that to kind of inform your conversation towards the gospel, which is cool.